Did you know that the most powerful empire in the world was shaken by a single man? Nero, the emperor whose insatiable thirst for power and luxury turned Rome into a field of chaos. But what led a young ruler to ruin a civilization that had conquered half the world? In this video, we'll reveal the details of Nero's downfall and how he, through his thoughtless decisions, caused the collapse of a dynasty that had ruled Rome for centuries. Get ready for a journey full of intrigue, betrayal, and conspiracies. And the big question, was Nero the only one to blame, or was he just a pawn in a power game that was already out of control? Stay until the end and find out. The fate of Rome intertwined with the birth of a boy who would one day shake the foundations of the empire. On December 15th, 37 AD, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born in Antium, a coastal city frequented by Roman nobility. His birth was surrounded by omens and superstitious whispers. Some said the boy would bring glory to his family. Others whispered that he would bring destruction. But one thing was certain. The imperial bloodline ran through his veins, and his existence was destined to be anything but ordinary. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was a man with a volatile temper, known for his arrogance and cruelty. He was a wealthy and influential senator, but his fame was tainted by dark stories. It was said that when he learned of his wife's pregnancy, he sarcastically remarked, "Nothing that comes from me and Agrippina could be born worthy or honorable." He wouldn't live long enough to see his son grow. Just a few years after Lucius's birth, he died under uncertain circumstances, leaving behind a legacy of contempt and a name marked by intrigue. Without the presence of his father, Lucius was raised under the shadow of his mother, Agrippina, a woman with fierce ambition. The daughter of Germanicus, the niece of Tiberius, and the great-granddaughter of Augustus, she carried the imperial bloodline in her veins, and her gaze was filled with cold determination that few dared to challenge. From a young age, Agrippina learned that power was not given, but taken. And if the men in her family had ruled Rome, why couldn't she shape the empire to her own desires? While other children ran through the gardens of Rome, playing carefree, Lucius grew up surrounded by whispers and conspiracies. From an early age, he was treated as a pawn in a game much larger than he could comprehend. The halls of the Palatine echoed with intrigue, betrayal, and alliances forged in the darkness. And Agrippina knew that, to survive and ensure that her son wasn't just another forgotten name in history, she would need to act with cunning. But Rome was a minefield. Agrippina's position at court was not secure, and her enemies watched her closely, waiting for the right moment to strike. The first major blow would not be long in coming. Before Lucius could understand the world into which he was born, his mother would taste the venom of betrayal and exile. The storm was approaching, and every move Agrippina made could be her last. But if there was one thing she knew how to do, it was survive. And for that, she was willing to do anything. Power in Rome was as unstable as a turbulent sea, and those who sailed its waters knew that a single mistake could lead to shipwreck. Agrippina, despite her intelligence and ambition, learned this lesson the hard way. Her privileged position at court crumbled when her brother, Caligula, ascended the throne in 37 AD. At first, Agrippina believed that her brother's rise to power would guarantee her safety and influence. After all, they shared the same blood, and she was part of the imperial family. But Caligula was no ordinary ruler. His reign quickly devolved into a spectacle of madness and cruelty. The emperor saw himself as a living god, a being above humanity, and his unpredictable behavior made anyone a potential target. For a woman like Agrippina, living at Caligula's court was like walking on sharp blades. Yet, she didn't flinch. She used her beauty and cunning to remain relevant and protect her son, Lucius. However, her fragile position crumbled when she became involved in a conspiracy against her own brother. The court whispered about the plot. Agrippina, her sister Livia, and her brother-in-law Lepidus were involved in a plan to depose Caligula. It's unclear whether the conspiracy was real or if Caligula, paranoid as he was, simply saw treason where there was none. But the sentence came quickly and ruthlessly. Lepidus was executed, and Agrippina, along with her sister, was exiled to a remote island. The exile was a cruel blow. From the opulence of the Palatine, where intrigues were woven among banquets and luxuries, Agrippina was cast into solitude and obscurity. Separated from her son, deprived of the comfort of a mother, Lucius grew up without the one person who truly cared about his destiny. But Agrippina was not a woman to accept defeat. For years, she remained on the sidelines, watching from afar as the empire's instability deepened. Caligula amassed enemies daily, and his madness would soon seal his fate. In 41 AD, the emperor was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard, clearing the way for a new ruler, Claudius. For many, Caligula's death was a relief. For Agrippina, it was an opportunity. With the throne now in the hands of a new emperor, she saw the chance to return to the political scene and reclaim what had been taken from her. Slowly, she rebuilt her influence, moving with the caution of a snake lying in wait. Her return wouldn't be immediate, but Agrippina knew that patience was as powerful a weapon as poison. She would return to Rome, and when she did, it would not be just to regain her place at court. She would return to ensure that her son would not just be another noble forgotten among so many others. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was still a boy, but one day he would be emperor, and Agrippina would not let anything or anyone stand in the way of that destiny. Agrippina returned to Rome like a quiet shadow, but her goal was clear: to secure her son Lucius's future. The new emperor, Claudius, was an odd man. Considered weak by many, he had come to the throne almost by accident after Caligula's execution. The Senate despised him, the military underestimated him, and the court saw him as a puppet to be manipulated. But it was precisely this weakness that Agrippina knew how to exploit to her advantage. Claudius was already married to Messalina, a woman of overwhelming beauty and influence. However, her thirst for power and pleasures became her downfall. In an unprecedented act of audacity, Messalina publicly married another man while Claudius was still emperor. Betrayed and humiliated, he ordered her execution, leaving the position of empress vacant. Rome expected Claudius to choose a new wife from the available noblewomen. But Agrippina wasn't about to leave this decision to chance. She approached the emperor with a game of seduction and intelligence. Unlike the women who sought to charm him with beauty and youth, Agrippina offered something much more valuable: stability, strategy, and the promise of a strong heir. However, the marriage faced a legal obstacle. Agrippina was Claudius's niece, and marriage between uncle and niece was seen as taboo. But in Rome, morality always yielded to political convenience. The Senate, pressured by Agrippina's growing influence, passed a new law allowing the union. Thus, in 49 AD, Agrippina became the new empress of Rome. Her first act was to ensure that her son, Lucius, was officially adopted by Claudius. With this, he received a new name, Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. This change seemed like a mere formal detail, but it was a crucial milestone. Nero was now the emperor's son, surpassing his natural rival, Britannicus, Claudius's legitimate son. The people celebrated the rise of the new empress. Unlike Messalina, who was seen as debauched and irresponsible, Agrippina projected an image of a strong and disciplined woman, the ideal Roman matron. But behind this virtuous facade, she moved her pieces with precision. Her network of allies expanded, her control over the emperor grew, and her plan was about to reach its peak. Britannicus was still a problem. As long as he lived, his lineage would remain a threat to Nero's rise. But Agrippina knew that time was on her side. Claudius was a sickly man and easily influenced. And if he changed his mind about the successor, she already had a solution prepared. The empress would leave nothing to chance. And when the right moment came, Claudius would pay the price for his naivety. Years passed, and the fate of Rome was about to change once again. Claudius, once a hesitant emperor, began to show signs of restlessness. Agrippina noticed this with concern. The old emperor, who had once allowed himself to be guided by her suggestions, now seemed more inclined to reevaluate his decision on the successor. Britannicus, Claudius's legitimate son, was growing quickly and would soon reach adulthood. Roman tradition dictated that upon reaching this stage, he could claim his rights to the throne, becoming a direct threat to Nero. Agrippina knew she couldn't allow that. The first signs that Claudius was beginning to change his mind came during private palace meetings. The emperor, influenced by old advisors and a natural affection for his biological son, began to mention Britannicus more often. He even hinted that the young man might share the rule with Nero, or even reassume his position as the primary heir. Agrippina understood the message. Claudius was reconsidering his succession, and that meant he was no longer useful to her. Rome's history had already shown that emperors could fall as quickly as they rose. And if Claudius became an obstacle to Agrippina's plans, his fate was already sealed. On the night of October 13th, 54 AD, a banquet was served at the imperial palace. Claudius, as usual, ate and drank with his ravenous appetite. Among the lavish dishes of the occasion was one of his favorites, mushrooms. But these mushrooms held a deadly secret. The chosen poison was no ordinary one. Agrippina entrusted the task to Locusta, a notorious poisoner of the time. The substance used was meant to act slowly and painfully, simulating a natural death. And that's exactly what happened. Hours after the dinner, Claudius began to feel unwell. He suffered convulsions, cold sweats, and his breathing became irregular. Some believe that, upon realizing he had been poisoned, he tried to alert his servants, but by then it was too late. However, Agrippina couldn't take any chances. To ensure that Claudius didn't survive, she ordered the imperial doctor to administer a peacock feather dipped in poison into his throat, under the pretense of helping him vomit. The final blow had been dealt. The next morning, Rome received the news. Emperor Claudius was dead. Officially, the court announced that he had died of natural causes, perhaps from indigestion. But few believed that version. With the emperor's death, Nero was promptly declared his successor. At 16 years old, he took the throne with the full support of his mother and the Senate, who saw in the young imperial figure a promise of renewal for Rome. The people celebrated, the senators paid their respects, and Agrippina remained in the shadows, observing it all with the coldness of one who had known the outcome of this story long before it happened. The throne now belonged to Nero. But he wasn't alone. Agrippina was the true force behind the power. And for Rome, the reign of the new emperor was only just beginning. Rome glistened with festivities. The young Nero, only 16, was greeted with cheers in the streets. The Senate saw in him the promise of a vigorous, youthful, and innovative government. The people, in turn, were swept up by the excitement of a new beginning. But behind the scenes, the true ruler was Agrippina. From the moment Nero assumed the throne, Agrippina positioned herself as the empress mother, an unofficial role but one of immense power. She attended the Senate alongside her son, something unprecedented for a woman in Roman society. Her words influenced imperial decisions. Her allies occupied the most strategic positions in government, and her vigilance over Nero was constant. The first few months were an extension of her will. The young emperor, inexperienced and uninterested in running the empire, blindly trusted his mother. He had other passions: art, theater, chariot races, poetry. For now, Rome was just a burden he left in the hands of Agrippina and her two main advisors, Seneca, the renowned Stoic philosopher, and Burrus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. Seneca and Burrus understood the situation well. They knew that Agrippina's power was absolute and that opposing her could mean a fatal downfall. However, both also recognized Nero's potential and gradually tried to shape him to take a more active role in governing. Meanwhile, Agrippina ensured that all important decisions passed through her. The decrees, political appointments, even the minted coins bore her image alongside her son's, an audacity uncommon for a woman in Rome. But her thirst for control was insatiable. Nights in the palace were filled with private meetings, where Agrippina made sure to remind Nero of what he owed her. "You owe everything to me," she would say, her voice controlled and her gaze piercing. "Without me, you would never have been emperor." However, despite her influence, some of Nero's actions began to worry her. He spent more and more time away from his government duties, involved in artistic performances and extravagant parties. He cared less about politics and more about the pleasures of life. But the first major rift between mother and son was yet to come. The young emperor, who had until then accepted Agrippina's shadow without question, would soon begin to challenge her control. And when that happened, their relationship would never be the same. The empire continued under Agrippina's firm influence, but something was beginning to change. Gradually, Nero, once submissive to his mother, began to show signs of dissatisfaction. His taste for worldly pleasures intensified, and he started surrounding himself with people who didn't bow to his mother's authority. The tipping point came with an unexpected romance. Nero fell madly in love with Act, a former slave of Greek origin. Agrippina was furious. To her, it was unthinkable that her son, the Emperor of Rome, would involve himself with someone so beneath his station. How could a man of the Julio-Claudian dynasty be swayed by a woman with no title, no name, no influence? Determined to impose her will, Nero brought Act to the palace and introduced her as his mistress. Agrippina's response was immediate. She did everything she could to drive her away, ordering the servants to block any contact between the two. But Nero, in an unprecedented act of defiance, ignored his mother's orders, and continued the romance. Tension grew. For the first time, the young emperor faced Agrippina directly. In one of their most heated confrontations, she accused him of being ungrateful and foolish. "You are emperor because of me," she screamed as Nero, pale and panting, tried to maintain composure. But Agrippina wouldn't settle for just words. Determined to reaffirm her control, she approached Britannicus, Claudius's legitimate son, and technically, the true heir to the throne. She began to insinuate that the young prince could be a viable alternative if Nero continued to distance himself from her. It was then that Nero realized his mother would not hesitate to topple him if he stepped out of her control. The conflict between them had stopped being a clash of wills and had become a struggle for power. And for Nero, only one of them could win. The pressure on Nero grew heavier. His mother, relentless in her quest for control, continued to manipulate events in her favor, and Britannicus, though young, became a constant threat to his reign. Agrippina, without hesitation, began to manipulate events so that Claudius's son would take the forefront, as if preparing Rome for a natural succession. Britannicus, only 14, had youth on his side. His name still echoed in Rome as the legitimate heir to the empire. The people adored the young prince, and his presence was always accompanied by an aura of sympathy. For Nero, this represented an increasing danger. The idea of sharing power with his half-brother was no longer a viable option. In the palace corridors, whispers began to spread. Some said that Britannicus, with his educated background and dignified bearing, was gaining secret support from some senators and even members of the Praetorian Guard. Others suggested that he could become a popular leader, ready to claim the throne once he came of age. Nero couldn't allow this to happen. Fear took over his young mind, and the paranoia of losing everything he had gained transformed into a destructive impulse. It was then that the fatal blow was struck. During a dinner at the palace, Britannicus began to feel ill. His initial complaints were minimal, but soon he was overcome with unbearable pain and fell into convulsions. The doctors called to attend him, most of them loyal to Nero, diagnosed poisoning, but the prince was already beyond any cure. While Britannicus was agonizing, Nero showed no emotion. His mind was focused solely on one thought. The threat to the throne had been eliminated. Britannicus' death, which occurred mysteriously and suddenly, was officially attributed to natural causes. However, rumors began circulating, suggesting that Nero had orchestrated the poisoning, perhaps with the help of his mother. As the news spread throughout Rome, a sense of shock and disbelief took hold of the city. What should have been a peaceful succession had turned into a bloody battleground, and the empire was now under the rule of Nero, free from direct rivals. Agrippina, for a moment, seemed satisfied with the elimination of Britannicus, but the truth was that she had just lost a crucial piece in the power game. And while Britannicus' body was being buried, Nero, now without obstacles, felt safer, but also more isolated. The shadow of the prince's death loomed over his soul, and the tension between him and his mother became more palpable by the day. With the death of Britannicus, Rome breathed a sigh of relief, but the empire was far from finding stability. Nero, although he had removed his last great threat to the throne, now faced a new and growing problem: his mother. Agrippina, though no longer facing the legitimate son of Claudius as an adversary, began to realize that her influence over Nero was waning. The young emperor gradually became aware of the power he held, and the desire to rule without his mother's constant supervision began to grow. The tension between mother and son turned into a power struggle. Agrippina, who always saw herself as the true regent of Rome, was unwilling to lose the position she had fought so hard to gain. She still believed she controlled the empire through Nero and made a point of involving herself in the most important decisions. However, Nero was determined to reverse this role. In the palace, the conflict became increasingly evident. Agrippina tried to maintain her authority, while Nero, now bolder, began to make decisions without consulting her. He distanced the old allies of his mother and started surrounding himself with new advisors, figures who saw in the young emperor an independent leader, free from maternal control. The point of no return was reached when, during a meeting with his top officials, Nero made a point of ignoring Agrippina's suggestions, dismissing her words with disdain. It was at this moment that his mother realized that her son no longer saw her as an ally, but as an obstacle. The image of the obedient boy she had worked so hard to shape was fading before her, and a relentless emperor was beginning to take his place. The public humiliation was a hard blow for Agrippina. Her own son, to whom she had given everything to rise to power, was now distancing himself from her, like a king who finds himself a slave to his own ambition. She couldn't accept this loss of control. So, in a desperate attempt to regain her position, she tried to take control through intimidation and intrigue. But Nero, now more confident, began to push her out of his trusted circles, creating an irreparable distance. The relationship between them, once indestructible, was now marked by an abyss of distrust and resentment. Agrippina, increasingly isolated, was seen by many as a shadow of the past, a figure who no longer had a place in the Rome Nero wanted to build. But the mother, always full of strategy, was not willing to give up. She knew that, to maintain her power, she would have to take the next step. And if necessary, she would overthrow her own son to make the empire hers again. The empire was in a downward spiral, and the atmosphere in the palace was once again dense and filled with tension. Nero, now completely distanced from his mother, saw Agrippina as an irreconcilable obstacle. More and more, he felt that her presence threatened his freedom and his control over the empire. For him, the only solution was to eliminate this threat once and for all. In Nero's eyes, his mother was a symbol of a past he wanted to erase, and the cruelty that had motivated her to put him on the throne now seemed to be the same cruelty he would need to use to rid himself of her. But his mind, once confused and influenced by the insecurities of youth, was beginning to turn cold and calculating. The idea of a clever assassination began to dominate his thoughts, and he devised a detailed plan to end Agrippina's life. The scene was meticulously planned. Nero, in his search for a death that would seem natural, ordered that a vessel be prepared for a distant voyage, where his mother would be isolated enough to fall victim to an attack with no witnesses. It appeared to be a leisure trip, with no suspicion about the emperor's intentions. However, the plan, although clever, did not go as Nero had imagined. The boat, designed to sink after being sabotaged, was meant to be the instrument of Agrippina's end. When she boarded the vessel and began the journey, the destruction mechanism was triggered. But to everyone's surprise, Agrippina survived. The boat sank partially, but she managed to escape the water, swimming to shore, exhausted but alive. The tension was palpable. Agrippina, weakened but aware that something was terribly wrong, already suspected her son's intentions. She knew betrayal was in play and felt that her end was near. As she walked, seeking help, Agrippina's fate was sealed. Nero's men, who were already waiting for her escape, were ready to finish the job. And then, with a sinister smile on his face, Nero sent his assassins to complete the plan. Mercilessly, Agrippina was attacked by those who had once been her allies, and the cruel murder was carried out. She died within minutes, with no chance to react. The empire, finally free from her presence, celebrated Nero's triumph. Or at least, that's what he thought. But Agrippina's death, far from bringing peace to the empire, plunged Rome into even greater chaos. The act of filicide, though hidden in the shadows of a supposed tragedy, would resonate through future generations as one of the cruelest in Roman history. Nero's power, in his final ascent, seemed untouchable, but his reign was beginning to be marked by the tragedy of a mother murdered by her own son, a scenario that would forever question his legitimacy as ruler. After Agrippina's murder, Nero believed he had finally freed himself from the chains of the past. He was now the absolute emperor of Rome, with no more threats within his own family. But the peace he had hoped for did not materialize. On the contrary, the empire entered a period of growing instability, and Nero's figure, more solitary and fickle, became increasingly detached from the reality of the empire. At first, the Romans believed that the death of his mother, though cruel, would give Nero the freedom he so longed for. However, it soon became clear that the young emperor lacked the necessary skills to rule such a vast and complex empire. His advisors were dismissed, and those he kept by his side were often in conflict with him or each other, leading to a disorganized and incoherent administration. With Nero's reign marked by extravagance and a focus on personal pleasure, Rome began to decline. The emperor did not care to maintain order in the provinces, and many governors found themselves increasingly undermined, without the support of a strong and cohesive empire. Tax collection became more difficult, and the Roman people, who had once revered Nero for his rise to power, began to revolt against the lack of effective leadership. At the same time, Nero plunged even deeper into personal pleasures. He indulged in boundless luxury, organizing extravagant parties and participating in artistic competitions, in which, over time, he became increasingly obsessed. He believed himself to be a great poet and artist, and instead of governing, he sought recognition in the arts. His performances were an expression of his vanity and desire to be idolized, but they could not conceal the emptiness the emperor felt. As Nero distanced himself further from the empire's affairs, corruption grew in the streets of Rome. The lower classes faced extreme hardships, and the senators, increasingly humiliated by the emperor's arrogance, lost their patience. The exorbitant taxes imposed for the reconstruction of Rome after the Great Fire of 64 AD devastated the people. The empire that had once been the greatest in the world was disintegrating, a victim of the moral and administrative decay of its ruler. Nero himself, deep down, knew he was losing control, but was unable to do anything to change the situation. His empire was crumbling beneath his feet, and he, who once seemed to hold destiny in his hands, was now a more isolated and disillusioned figure. The dream of a glorious empire, ruled by a fearless young leader, was collapsing in a succession of mistakes and excesses. And as Rome descended into decadence, Nero continued to lose himself in the echo of his own desires, blind to the tragedy approaching. It was a hot afternoon in July of 64 AD, when in one of the most densely populated neighborhoods of Rome, a flame began to spread. The fire, which started in the merchants' shops at the southern edge of the city, quickly spread through the narrow wooden streets. Within hours, the flames consumed large parts of the capital, devastating entire areas and reducing the city to a scene of desolation. The calamity was immense, and no one knew for certain what lay behind the disaster. Among the Roman citizens, rumors and speculations began to emerge. Some said the fire had been accidental, a simple mistake by a merchant who, while trying to light his shop, had triggered the tragedy. Others, however, more skeptical, believed the fire was part of a larger plan, orchestrated by Nero himself. After all, the emperor, who had an insatiable appetite for rebuilding the city in his own image, might have wanted the fire to destroy Rome so he could rebuild it, more grand and splendid than ever. Nero's behavior during the fire only fueled these suspicions. While the flames consumed Rome, Nero was at his villa, playing the lyre and singing, seemingly indifferent to the suffering of his city and people. When the flames began to threaten his own imperial residence, he surprisingly stepped away from the center of the crisis, rather than leading relief efforts. Some said he was more interested in turning the disaster into an opportunity to display his art and talents as an artist, rather than caring about the empire in ruins. But for those who dared question Nero's behavior, the answers were never clear. The emperor, trying to protect himself from growing accusations, blamed a minority group, the Christians. Despite still being a small and distrusted sect, the Christians were unjustly accused of starting the fire, an attempt to divert attention from Nero himself. He initiated a brutal persecution, capturing and torturing many of them. Some were burned alive to serve as human torches, lighting the paths of the empire. The Roman people, already restless with Nero's excesses and neglect, began to question his character and intentions even more. Rumors spread, saying that Nero had actually ordered the fire, or at least allowed it to spread, believing it would give him the opportunity to rebuild the city with his own grand architectural design. The accusations that the fire was a conspiracy gained strength, and the empire found itself divided between devotion to an emperor who was increasingly becoming a symbol of madness and excess, and the growing revolt of the population, which was beginning to turn against him. The fire of Rome, therefore, was not just a physical disaster, but also an event that marked the beginning of a period of distrust and resentment toward Nero. Although the true cause of the fire was never confirmed, the event became a landmark in the history of his reign, fueling the fire of unpopularity that threatened to consume his authority. With the city of Rome in ruins and the population desperate from the tragedy, Nero, trying to divert attention from his disastrous administration, found a perfect scapegoat: the Christians. A small sect, whose members were often seen as eccentric and with strange customs, the Christians were blamed for the fire, even though there was no concrete evidence linking them to the disaster. The emperor, desperate for a way to restore his image, knew that persecuting a marginalized and misunderstood group would be an effective way to divert attention from his own incompetence. The persecution of the Christians began gradually, but soon took alarming proportions. The Senate, afraid of going against Nero's will, supported the imperial decree, and the people, already filled with fear and anger after the fire, accepted the accusation against the Christians as truth. Soon, those who professed the new faith were hunted in the streets, in their homes, and even in the catacombs where they sought refuge. Nero used terrifying violence to punish the Christians, turning them into martyrs, but also into a symbol of his own cruelty. The Christians were subjected to indescribable tortures, such as being burned alive, crucified, and thrown to the beasts in public arenas. These executions were not just a means of punishment, but also a grotesque spectacle for the delight of the population, who gathered to watch the carnage. The empire, which had once been a beacon of civilization, was becoming a stage of terror, where Nero used human life as a bargaining chip to maintain his untarnished image and reinforce his control. But despite all attempts to eradicate Christianity, something began to happen. The Christians, even in the face of death and suffering, maintained their faith and unity. Many of their martyrs became symbols of resistance and courage, and although persecuted, their numbers continued to grow. Even in the midst of chaos, the flame of Christian faith did not die out, becoming more and more a cry of hope against the oppression of the empire. The persecution, however, was not only an attack on those who followed a different religion. It was an attempt by Nero to reaffirm his power over an empire that was beginning to question and rebel against him. By attacking the Christians, he was trying to restore his authority, but his relentless and brutal attitude only deepened the chasm between him and his people. As the persecution intensified, Rome, instead of uniting under Nero's leadership, became more fragmented. The population was increasingly divided between those who opposed Nero and those who still saw him as a figure of power. But Christianity, despite being persecuted so ferociously, was not extinguished. On the contrary, its faith and influence continued to grow, becoming a force that would eventually change the destiny of the Roman Empire forever. Nero, in his desperate attempt to destroy the Christians and extinguish the flame of their faith, ended up creating an even stronger movement that over time would become the backbone of what would be Western civilization. The emperor, unknowingly, was contributing to the formation of a legacy that would last for millennia, while his own memory would be lost in history as an example of tyranny and madness. Nero's empire, once vibrant and prosperous, began to fragment under the weight of growing popular dissatisfaction. The fire in Rome and the persecution of Christians were just the tip of the iceberg of a much deeper crisis unfolding behind the scenes of the empire. The city's reconstruction, which was meant to be a demonstration of renewal and greatness, became an unbearable burden for the Roman population. Obsessed with building grand monuments and opulent palaces, such as the famous Domus Aurea, Nero squandered public resources extravagantly. In his quest to leave a legacy of magnificence, he didn't hesitate to raise taxes and resort to loans. The cost to the Roman people was extremely high, and those already struggling to survive the economic hardships began to feel the devastating effects of the imperial administration. The gold Nero used to beautify his city was taken from the hands of ordinary Romans, who found themselves increasingly overwhelmed. With a scarcity of resources, the market began to collapse. The Roman currency lost its value, and inflation skyrocketed. Food became scarce, and lower-class Romans faced immense struggles to feed themselves. The situation worsened when Nero, in a desperate attempt to maintain his image as an enlightened emperor, imposed higher taxes on the middle class and merchants, further increasing social tensions. Meanwhile, Nero indulged in his passions: lavish festivals, theatrical performances, and chariot races. He seemed indifferent to the suffering of his people, focused only on his own display and pleasure. His popularity among the masses, already in decline, plummeted even further. Romans began to question Nero's ability to rule, and his administration became synonymous with decadence and corruption. Popular discontent grew to an unsustainable point. The streets of Rome became filled with murmurs and insurrections, and aristocrats began distancing themselves from Nero, fearing for their own safety and the future of the empire. The Senate, already humiliated and weakened, now found itself pressured by both internal and external tensions. The Roman elite began to question whether it was worth continuing to support an emperor whose decisions were leading the empire to collapse. As Rome sank into an unprecedented economic crisis, the empire began to lose its balance. Nero himself, immersed in his own excesses and incapable of understanding the real needs of his people, seemed increasingly disconnected from the reality of Rome. His obsession with building an empire to his own taste with golden palaces and lavish festivals, only widened the gap between him and those who sustained the empire with their hard work. The economic collapse and growing popular discontent became the fertile ground for the destabilization of Nero's power. The empire, already in tatters, began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. Dissatisfaction spread across all layers of Roman society, and a silent revolution was brewing, one that would soon challenge the imperial throne itself. Nero's turmoil was far from just political and economic. His personal affairs also became a stage for intrigue, manipulation, and tragedy. The young emperor, still seeking a way to restore his popularity, found solace and passion in Poppaea Sabina, a woman of great beauty and ambition. She knew exactly how to use her charm to win not only Nero's heart but also his power. However, there was a significant obstacle to this new relationship. Nero's wife Octavia, daughter of Claudius and a woman respected by the Roman people for her composure and virtue. Although married to Nero, Octavia had little power over him, as the emperor, increasingly influenced by Poppaea, desired his freedom to pursue his desires. Octavia's presence in Nero's life became an inconvenience, a barrier between him and his new lover. The pressure on Nero increased. Poppaea, relentless in her ambitions, was unwilling to live in the shadow of a legitimate wife. She demanded that Nero take decisive action, and Nero, eager to please his new lover, made a drastic decision. He accused Octavia of adultery, a serious crime in imperial Rome. The accusation, however, was nothing more than an invention, a maneuver to eliminate the wife who had become an obstacle to his desires. Without further ado, Nero ordered Octavia's execution. The cruel fate of Octavia was not just a personal tragedy, but also an irreparable break with the Roman people. The young empress, once seen as a figure of purity and integrity, was murdered by the orders of her own husband, and her death caused a murmur of indignation among the population. For many, Octavia represented the virtue of Rome, and her death at Nero's hands reflected his growing decadence. With Octavia's death, Nero finally gave in to Poppaea, marrying her in a grand ceremony. The new empress was a woman of strong ambitions, but her rise to power also marked the beginning of a relationship marked by excesses and violence. Poppaea, who had previously won Nero over with her charm and persuasion, now held the power to shape his decisions, further deepening the decadence of the Roman Empire. However, while Nero enjoyed his new union, a shadow of guilt and regret began to weigh on his shoulders. The murder of Octavia and the break with one of Rome's most beloved figures were not easily forgotten. The wounds left by the tragic fate of his wife continued to haunt Nero, though he seemed oblivious to any sense of morality. In his mind, Poppaea was the key to the future of his empire, and with her by his side, he believed he could finally restore his power and image. But as always in his life, the echoes of his dark choices continued to reverberate, setting the stage for more tragedies that would unfold during his reign. Nero's life was a tangled web of unchecked passions, unrestrained ambitions, and personal tragedies. His new empress, Poppaea Sabina, with her charm and influence, had completely won over the emperor, shaping his decisions and his destiny. However, the relationship between them was far from idyllic. What had started with great enthusiasm would soon become a scene of fury and distrust. In AD 65, an unexpected tragedy shook the imperial court. Poppaea Sabina died under suspicious circumstances. Some said she died during a violent argument with Nero, when he, in a fit of rage, pushed her, leading to a fatal collapse. Others, more discreet, suggested she might have been a victim of an illness, or even that Nero, enraged by an act of betrayal or simple whim, had murdered her. The fact is that Poppaea's death left an indelible mark on history, with many conflicting versions about the cause of the event. Nero's mourning, however, was brief. Shortly after his wife's death, he became involved with a new character, someone of entirely unexpected origins. It was a former slave named Doryphorus, a man without the usual nobility or status of the emperor's wives, but whom Nero, in his growing decadence, seemed to prefer. This relationship not only shocked the Roman elite, but also challenged all the norms and conventions of a deeply hierarchical and aristocratic society. Nero's marriage to Doryphorus caused a huge scandal in Rome. To many, the emperor had become an unrecognizable figure. He had abandoned imperial traditions and given in to a relationship that not only defied the status quo, but also made an irreparable break with the legacy of the great emperors. The Roman elite, with its rigid and traditional view of politics and morality, could not comprehend how Nero, An emperor who should be the embodiment of greatness and virtue could degrade himself to this extent. Despite the scandal, Nero seemed to be in his element. He threw himself into this new relationship with the same intensity he had devoted to his other relationships and to power. He also seemed increasingly distant from his people, immersed in a world of personal indulgence and excesses that no longer made sense to most Romans. The empire, already torn apart by a failed economy and erratic government, now faced an emperor who, to many, had become unrecognizable, lost in his own madness. Meanwhile, rumors about the death of Poppaea continued to circulate, and tensions within the empire were escalating. Nero's increasingly erratic behavior and growing detachment from the empire's concerns had the Romans questioning his leadership. The empire was on the brink of disaster, and Nero's personal and political choices only hastened Rome's decline. As Rome sank deeper into chaos, Nero's rule, weakened by his own decadence and rising public dissatisfaction, began facing serious internal challenges. Nero's trust in his advisors and allies was dwindling, especially after the death of his mother and the execution of his wife. The emperor had become increasingly paranoid, fearing conspiracies around him. His suspicious gaze fell on everyone, even those who had once been his greatest allies. In 65 AD, a conspiracy involving the senator Calpurnius Piso emerged from the shadows. Piso, along with other members of the Roman elite, was determined to overthrow Nero, whose actions were now seen as destructive to the empire. The conspiracy, known as the Piso conspiracy, aimed to assassinate the emperor and replace his government with a more stable regime capable of restoring order to the empire. However, news of the conspiracy quickly leaked, and Nero's paranoia intensified even further. Among the conspirators was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher and former tutor to Nero. Seneca, who had been an important figure in the emperor's government, was forced to get involved in political intrigues, but at the same time, he began to distance himself from Nero's madness. He futilely tried to maintain some rationality in the empire, attempting to guide the young emperor toward prudence. However, as Nero sank further into tyranny and desperation, Seneca became a target. When the Piso conspiracy was discovered, Nero reacted with the brutality that had become his trademark. He not only dismantled the conspiracy violently, but in his paranoia, ordered that Seneca be accused of treason. Seneca, who had tried to serve as Nero's mentor and advisor, was imprisoned and sentenced to death. The order was clear: he was to commit suicide. Seneca's death was one of the most tragic in the Roman Empire. The philosopher, who had been a respected figure for his wisdom and virtue, had his life brutally taken by an emperor he had once considered a promising pupil. With dignity and serenity, Seneca accepted his sentence. With his last words, he asked his friends not to mourn his death, but to accept the inevitability of fate. His death was not only a personal blow to Stoic philosophy, but also a reflection of the degradation of Nero's government. By eliminating one of his most capable and respected advisors, Nero not only demonstrated the depth of his paranoia, but also removed the last figures of authority who might have, in some way, tried to save the empire from its impending destruction. The Roman Empire, already on the brink of collapse, now seemed destined to sink even further into its own decadence. Seneca, one of the greatest thinkers of his era, was remembered for his wisdom and his death during a moment of deep crisis for Rome. The Piso conspiracy, which had initially threatened the empire, ended up reflecting an empire that had become a battleground of betrayals, intrigues, and above all, the loss of all reason and stability. As the years passed, Nero became increasingly distant from the institutions that had been fundamental to the stability of the Roman Empire. His rule, marked by extravagance, cruelty, and growing insanity, was no longer sustained by the trust of the senators or the military. The relationship between the emperor and the Senate, which had once been a complex but functional alliance, was now rapidly disintegrating as Nero made impulsive and authoritarian choices, ignoring the advice of Rome's more experienced leaders. The Senate, composed of powerful and elderly men, began to feel the pressure of an emperor who no longer respected republican conventions, the traditions that had sustained Rome for centuries. Nero not only publicly humiliated the senators, but also made decisions without consulting the Senate's advice, ruling more and more in a solitary and egocentric manner. His growing paranoia led him to believe that everyone around him was a potential traitor, and so he isolated or executed them without mercy. Among Nero's most dramatic actions against the Senate was the execution of influential figures, including those seen as representatives of the old Republican Guard. Public executions became common, and Nero's sense of impunity only grew. With each step, the Senate found itself more impotent, more humiliated, and its authority seemed to carry no weight against an emperor who appeared to have become completely detached from the political reality of Rome. Nero's distancing from the Senate was not only a governance issue, but also a reflection of his own disconnection from Rome's values. He believed that his will alone was sufficient to rule the vast empire, without the need for alliances or moderation. This provoked growing disdain among the senators, who saw themselves not only weakened, but completely ignored. The effects of this rupture were devastating to the stability of the empire. The lack of political support meant that Nero no longer had the foundations that upheld Rome's central power. The army, increasingly dissatisfied with Nero's administration, also began to distance itself from him. Roman generals, who had once fought in the name of a strong emperor, now saw Nero as a tyrant incapable of maintaining order. His rule, already unstable, was now vulnerable. With the loss of support from the Senate and military forces, Nero's position became increasingly fragile. Internal revolts and signs of popular discontent began to multiply. The Rome that had once been proud of its greatness now found itself torn apart by political intrigues and a leadership immersed in decadence. Nero, who had believed himself invincible, was beginning to realize that his self-confidence and isolation from his allies had sealed his fate. The Roman Empire, once considered invincible, now found itself on the brink of disaster, and the flames of revolt began to burn in various parts of the territory. Each day, Nero's authority diminished more rapidly, and the seeds of local rebellions, once silent, began to sprout. Gaul, one of the most distant and at the same time most crucial provinces for the empire, was the first to openly rebel against the emperor. The leader of the revolt was Vindex, the governor of Gaul. Vindex, a man of fiery spirit and disillusioned with Nero's tyranny, had been tested by the constant abuses and the empire's decadence. The breaking point came when Nero, in a completely indifferent act, decided to raise taxes on the provinces, a harsh blow to the already exhausted inhabitants of Gaul. Vindex, who had long harbored growing dissatisfaction, saw an opportunity to act. He declared himself emperor, challenging Nero's authority and calling for the restoration of Rome's true greatness. Vindex's movement was not just a regional revolt, but an attempt to return power to a more sensible emperor, something that many in various parts of the empire desired. By making this move, Vindex was seeking new leadership for Rome, believing that Nero's tyranny had exceeded acceptable limits. However, despite his charisma and determination, Vindex was unable to secure victory. Nero's response, a desperate attempt to maintain control, was to send an army against the rebels. But on the battlefield, Vindex's forces, increasingly motivated by their cause, achieved a significant victory. Nero, seeing his authority questioned for the first time so palpably, was left completely disoriented. When news of the rebellion reached Rome, the Senate, which had already distanced itself from Nero and grown increasingly bitter, wasted no time in joining Vindex's cause. Seeing that the revolt in Gaul could be the beginning of the end for Nero, many senators decided to support the rise of a new leader, someone capable of restoring order and honor to Rome. This leader, Galba, the governor of Hispania, was chosen by the senators as the new emperor. Galba was a man of strong character and humble origins, but his reputation for discipline and integrity made him a figure admired, especially among the military. Once Galba received the Senate's support, his rise became inevitable. He gathered his troops and marched toward Rome, determined to overthrow Nero and restore stability to the empire. As Galba prepared to take the throne, Nero's position became increasingly untenable. News of the revolt and Galba's rise spread quickly throughout the empire, and many of Nero's allies began to abandon him. His court, once full of admirers and accomplices, was now empty, and the emperor's last resistance was disintegrating. In a power struggle for survival, Nero now faced a concrete threat he could not ignore. Galba's rise, stemming from a revolt in distant Gaul, became the turning point in the Roman Empire. Nero's name, once associated with great power, began to fade from the minds of his former allies. With the empire crumbling around him, Nero had no choice but to confront the reality of his decline. Vindex's blow in Gaul and the growing support for Galba within Rome marked the end of his authority. His empire, once imposing and full of splendor, was now in ruins, and Nero's position became a shadow of what it once was. The widespread rejection by the Senate, the army, and even many of his former allies was enough to ensure that Rome's trust in him was irreversibly lost. Upon learning of Galba's rise, Nero found himself isolated and helpless. Escape seemed to be his only option, but the decision did not come clearly or planned. He tried to gather a small army of loyalists to resist Galba and the advancing forces, but it soon became evident that the support he sought was scarce and the fight was unequal. The streets of Rome, once a place where he had been the central figure of power, were now filled with murmurs of disdain and betrayal. Nero retreated from the heart of the city, heading to a villa on its outskirts, where he lived as a fugitive, a shadow of the emperor who once ruled with an iron hand. But the solitude of escape was not kind. In an act of desperation, he tried to take refuge in his own luxurious residence, but he knew that the weight of his own history, marked by blood and tyranny, could not be easily erased. His most loyal followers were few, and among them, fear of Galba and a loss of faith in their leader began to grow. Isolated in his villa, Nero reflected on the greatness he once had. He tried, in his mind, to desperately restore his empire and past glories, but the lack of resources and support made any attempt seem increasingly futile. The people, who once adored and feared him, now rejoiced at his impending fall. Rumors of his flight spread quickly through Rome, and far from finding refuge, Nero was increasingly surrounded by the sense that the empire he had tried to rebuild according to his own whims was now irreversibly disintegrating. As he found himself in his self-imposed exile, Galba's forces drew nearer to Rome, ready to take the city and complete what seemed to be the definitive end of his dynasty. Nero was no longer the invincible emperor. He was now a fugitive, without friends, advisors, or an empire to govern. The complete isolation in which he lived reflected the true magnitude of his fall. In the depths of his solitude, Nero began to realize that there was no longer any escape for him. The grandeur of Rome had been replaced by an unbearable weight, and the glory he believed he deserved had turned into a nightmare he could no longer avoid. The sense of an end was in the air, and Nero knew it. The empire he had believed he controlled with such certainty was in ruins, and the echoes of his decadence resonated on every corner of Rome. The support of his few followers disappeared like sand slipping through fingers, and the Senate's eyes, now firmly focused on Galba, awaited him to seal his fate. The city, which had once been the stage of his grand rise, now felt like a strange, almost hostile place. On the last day of his life, Nero was consumed by hopelessness. He knew his fall was inevitable. The empire he had tried to shape according to his extravagant visions was on the verge of a new chapter, and he was no longer a part of it. His name, once filled with power, now became synonymous with chaos and cruelty. Every piece of news that reached him only deepened his despair. Galba was approaching, and the Senate had declared him a public enemy. Desperate and without options, Nero reflected on what remained of his life, or what could remain. He had been an emperor who, in his quest for personal glory, destroyed what he loved most, the empire itself. The feasts, the games, the grand speeches, all now seemed empty, an illusion that crumbled in the face of the harsh reality of his downfall. In an attempt to escape capture, Nero took refuge in his final home, a secluded place far from the eyes of Rome, where he had tried to find some solace in his solitude. The very palace that had once been his resplendent court now seemed empty and gloomy. He sent messengers to ask for support, but he knew that no one would come. The army, once loyal, now abandoned him for Galba, and his advisors had distanced themselves, fearing for their own lives. Nero no longer had allies, and his lavish court had been reduced to a small entourage of servants and the disillusioned. It was in one of these moments of despair, while trying to decide between fighting to the end or succumbing to his sad reality, that Nero received the last piece of news that would seal his fate. Galba was about to take Rome, and his death was only a matter of time. The empire, which he had once believed was his to command, was about to move on without him. And at that moment, Nero realized he no longer had the strength to keep fighting. With a decision made in his mind, he sought out his faithful servant, Epaphroditus, who was one of the few who had stayed by his side. "What an artist the world is losing," were his last words, a reflection of his unshakable vanity until his final breath, a remnant of Nero who, until the end, believed that his name would remain in the annals of history. He asked his servant to help him escape Galba's capture, but the path to freedom was closed. Faced with a life without meaning and without support, Nero chose to end his own story. With a dagger in hand, and after a long moment of reflection, he took his life, bringing an end to an era of tyranny and decadence. Nero's final act, in his hopelessness and solitude, was the full stop of a dynasty that had begun with the great Augustus, but was now falling into disgrace. Nero's death was not just the fall of a man, but the collapse of an empire where arrogance and the pursuit of power had eroded its foundations. His death, in heavy silence, was not met with lamentation, but with relief. Rome, which had once feared and adored Nero, now moved forward without him, into a new era marked by the fall of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the beginning of a new cycle of uncertainties and internal struggles. On June 9, 68 AD, Nero met his end at his own hands, a death as solitary as his life had become. The empire, which had once hailed him as the future of Golden Rome, now saw him as a traitor to his own greatness. The figure who had once dazzled the streets of Rome with his imposing presence and extravagant displays of power now became a distant echo, remembered only for his failures, his abuses, and his decadence. Nero, now isolated in his retreating home, could no longer find refuge or solace. The loss of his empire was a fatal blow to his spirit, and despite his vanity and desire for greatness, he knew history would not be kind to him. Galba, the new emperor, was about to take the throne, and he could no longer escape his fate. The decision had been made, and there was no reason to delay the inevitable. As the sound of Galba's troops drew closer, Nero, with a lost look and a mind filled with despair, sought the company of his most loyal servant, Epaphroditus. He was the one who had accompanied the emperor to the final days of his flight. Nero asked him to help him escape, but the gates of Rome, which he had once ruled, were now closed to him. The empire had turned against him, and even the few who still risked standing by him knew there was no way out. In one final attempt to salvage what remained of his image, Nero ordered some of his followers to prepare his funeral and announce his death with great pomp. But deep down, he knew he couldn't fool anyone. He was alone, and the theater he had tried to construct in his mind was collapsing. The opulence that had once surrounded his name now seemed like a cruel joke. Faced with the inevitable end, Nero withdrew to a more private part of the residence. He asked Epaphroditus to leave him alone for a moment, so he could reflect in silence. When the servant withdrew, the emperor was left alone, surrounded by memories of his grand youth, an empire that was no longer his, and the certainty that death would finally find him, relentless and final. The silence of the house was heavy, and as he looked at the dagger he held, Nero felt a shiver run through him, a mix of fear and resignation. He, who had ruled with fear and cruelty, was now consumed by them, and with one last breath of vanity, he surrendered to the end, striking himself with the dagger. His last thought was a reflection of the man he always believed himself to be, a great artist, someone whose death would echo as an irreplaceable loss to the world. "What an artist the world is losing," were his final words, an egotistical statement that would become a bitter reminder of the madness that had consumed him. However, Nero's death was not a tragic or solemn event. It was the conclusion of a story of excess, tyranny, and decadence, which left Rome forever marked. His suicide did not bring peace, but rather the end of a turbulent era. The Senate, once submissive, now rejoiced at the fall of a tyrant. The population, who had lived in fear of the emperor, was finally free. And Rome, even amid the chaos, began to rebuild itself slowly, but without Nero to stifle its hopes. The memory of Nero, marked by condemnation and disdain, was sentenced to oblivion, a reminder of an empire that for a brief period was governed by the illusion of grandeur. With Nero's death, the imperial Rome breathed a sigh of relief, but at the same time, the emperor who had fallen so abruptly left behind a legacy of terror that would not be easily erased. Even with his death, the shadow of his tyranny still hung over the city. The Senate, in its attempt to erase any trace of his reign, decreed the damnatio memoriae, an official condemnation of his memory, an act that sought to remove his name from all historical records. Statues were torn down, inscriptions erased, and any trace that pointed to the emperor was destroyed. However, as often happens with the greatest names in history, his figure, though destroyed, remained alive in the collective memory of Rome. Nero had been a man of intense contrasts. On one hand, a ruler obsessed with glory and art. On the other, a ruthless tyrant whose cruelty scarred an entire generation. His reign, at its core, was marked by a constant struggle between the desires of a man who believed himself to be a divine figure and the interests of an empire that was increasingly distancing itself from its former greatness. His persecution of Christians, which reached brutal proportions during the final years of his rule, not only left deep scars on the population, but also established a model of repression that would endure for many years. When Rome was consumed by flames during the Great Fire of 64 AD, suspicions that Nero had, in fact, ordered the fire to reconstruct the city according to his architectural fantasies fueled an eternal resentment. Even without direct evidence, the distrust grew, making the emperor the target of the rage of many. Additionally, his extravagant parties and uncontrolled behaviors became the symbol of an era in which the empire distanced itself from the republican principles that had given it birth. Corruption and decadence, now associated with his memory, sank the empire into a spiral of chaos. The state's finances were at rock bottom. The legions had become more loyal to regional leaders than to the emperor himself, and ultimately, the empire's security was deeply compromised. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Nero's legacy was his irreversible break with Rome's elite. The Senate, humiliated and enraged, not only opposed Nero while he was still alive, but now, after his death, clamored for his destruction. The senatorial elite, which had long been forced to deal with the demands of a selfish emperor, now found itself in a position to seize power once again. They launched a major campaign to erase Nero's memory, and as this unfolded, Rome began to face a leadership vacuum, as no one could immediately replace the force of his presence. In the midst of this destruction, the empire became increasingly fragile. The rise of Galba and the beginning of the turbulence known as the Year of the Four Emperors was merely the reflection of an empire in disintegration. The lack of a strong ruler capable of restoring order led to a civil war, where all the emperors saw themselves as the only alternative to save Rome. The void left by Nero's death was filled with uncertainty, betrayals, and confrontations as Rome struggled to rebuild, unsure of what the future held. Nero's end was not just the end of a man, but the close of an era. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had begun with the grandeur of Augustus, now succumbed to chaos and disillusionment. And although Nero's name was banished from official history, the effects of his rule and the lessons of his reign continued to resonate for many years, a bitter reminder that the relentless pursuit of power can, in the end, destroy the very empire one seeks to rule. The Roman Empire, which for centuries had seemed invincible, was about to be thrown into the abyss of uncertainty. Nero's death not only sealed the fate of the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, but also dismantled the foundations of an empire that had, until then, seemed unbeatable. The dynasty, which had begun with the rise of Augustus, Rome's first emperor, now ended with Nero's collapse, leaving a power vacuum that would become the perfect stage for the political turbulence to follow. In the days following Nero's death, Rome was in a state of absolute chaos. The Senate, still furious with the emperor's atrocities, declared that he should be forgotten, that his memory should be erased. However, what no one could foresee was that the collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty would trigger a series of events that would bring Rome to the brink of collapse. The imperial power, once guaranteed by the lineage of Julius Caesar, was now up for grabs. Several claimants to the throne began to emerge, but none were truly capable of restoring order. The empire found itself plunged into a civil war, where rival factions fought for control of Rome, each trying to outdo the other. The year 69 AD would become marked by the rise and fall of four different emperors: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. Galba, the first to be proclaimed emperor after Nero's death, failed to maintain the support of the legions and was overthrown within months. Otho, who took power after Galba's death, also failed to consolidate his rule and was defeated by Vitellius, a popular military commander in the provinces. Vitellius, in turn, had a short and tumultuous reign, ultimately being defeated by the forces of Vespasian, a prominent general in the campaigns against the Jews. Vespasian eventually consolidated his power and established the Flavian dynasty, bringing an end to the instability that followed Nero's fall. The Flavian dynasty brought new hope to Rome, but the legacy of the Julio-Claudians would never be completely erased. The impact of Nero's actions, his tyranny, his extravagances, and the decadence of his court would endure in the memories of future generations. The Roman Empire, though still powerful, had lost the stability that marked its peak. The transition from the Julio-Claudian dynasty to the Flavians was not just a change of leadership, but the end of an era that began with Rome's republican ideals, but ultimately collapsed under the weight of corruption and misrule. The fall of the Julio-Claudian dynasty also symbolized the beginning of a new phase for the empire, one where power would become more fragmented and internal disputes between factions would intensify, giving rise to more tyrants and unpopular rulers. The memory of Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero would be reevaluated over the centuries, but one thing was clear. The Rome of old, the powerful and prosperous city, would never be the same. Thus, with the fall of the dynasty that represented the foundation of the empire, Rome entered a new phase of challenges and attempts at reconstruction. The end of an era carried with it the foretelling of a new reality, one that would test Rome's ability to reinvent itself. And so, with Nero's fall and the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Rome entered a turbulent new chapter in its history. A story of rise, decline, and reinvention, which still echoes through the halls of the empire that once conquered the world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the events that marked the end of an era, leave your comment below. What do you think Rome's future could have been if Nero had survived? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more content about Rome's history and other unmissable curiosities. Until the next video, where we'll continue exploring the mysteries and defining moments of this civilization that still fascinates the world.